I sat in that mahogany-paneled law office surrounded by my estranged parents and relatives I hadn't seen in 10 years. My grandfather's funeral was yesterday, and today the will reading reveals he left me his entire $2.5 billion empire. My parents, who cut me off at 18 for refusing to marry their business partner's son, are now grinning widely, already discussing how they'll help manage my inheritance. But the lawyer hasn't finished reading yet. The silence in that conference room was deafening as Attorney Richardson adjusted his glasses and continued reading from the leather-bound document. My heart pounded against my ribs while I watched my parents exchange those satisfied glances they used to share when they thought they'd won some social battle. Jacqueline Marie Stevens, the lawyer's voice echoed off the polished walls, is hereby designated as sole beneficiary of the Samuel Theodore Stevens estate, valued at approximately $2.5 billion. My mother, Patricia, practically bounced in her burgundy leather chair. "Well, naturally, we'll need to establish proper management protocols," she announced to the room, her perfectly manicured fingers already reaching for her phone. Jacqueline has absolutely no experience handling this magnitude of financial responsibility. My father, Robert, nodded sagely from his position at the head of the conference table. "We've maintained extensive business relationships throughout Samuel's empire. The transition should be seamless under our guidance." I wanted to laugh at their audacity. These were the same people who'd thrown me out of their Westchester mansion a decade ago because I refused to marry Harrison Blackwood, their chosen puppet for merging family businesses. The same parents who'd ignored every birthday, every holiday, every attempt I'd made to reconcile over the years. "There's more." Attorney Richardson interrupted, his expression growing troubled. "During the estate audit, we discovered some concerning irregularities." My cousin Bradley shifted uncomfortably in his chair near the window. He'd always been the family mediator, the one who'd tried to convince me that my parents only wanted what was best when I was 18. Now, his usually confident demeanor seemed strained. "What kind of irregularities?" I asked, finding my voice for the first time since entering this room. Richardson consulted another document. "Unauthorized withdrawals totaling $53 million were made from your grandfather's primary accounts over the past 8 months. The signatures appear to match Samuel's, but our handwriting expert has identified them as forgeries." The color drained from my mother's face. She clutched her new Hermes bag tighter, the same bag I'd noticed cost more than my annual nursing salary. "That's ridiculous," she stammered. "Samuel required extensive medical care during his final months. Those expenses were astronomical." But I remembered my grandfather's last visit to my cramped studio apartment in Queens. He'd climbed 3 flights of stairs despite his failing health, just to apologize for not protecting me from my parents' manipulation years ago. "Jacqueline," he'd whispered, holding my hands with his trembling fingers, "I'm going to make this right. I promise you'll never have to worry about money again, and they'll never be able to hurt you." That was 6 months before he passed away from lung cancer. Samuel's medical bills are fully documented through Mount Sinai Hospital. Richardson continued, his tone growing sharper. "The expenses in question were processed through companies that don't appear to exist: luxury care services, premium medical solutions, elite recovery systems, all registered to post office boxes in New Jersey." My father's jaw tightened. "Our accountant handled those arrangements. Perhaps there was some confusion in the filing process." "Your accountant?" I repeated slowly, pieces of a puzzle beginning to form in my mind. "The same accountant who convinced grandfather to sign a power of attorney last year." Bradley finally spoke up, his voice defensive. "Uncle Samuel was struggling with his medication schedule. Someone needed to help manage his affairs during treatment." I studied my cousin's face, searching for the honesty I'd once trusted. We'd been close as children, building blanket forts and sharing secrets during family gatherings, but something in his eyes now seemed calculated, rehearsed. Richardson pulled out a thick folder. "Our forensic team traced these transactions to 3 shell companies registered in Delaware. The funds were subsequently transferred to multiple offshore accounts." He looked directly at my parents. "Accounts bearing both of your names as beneficiaries." My mother stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor. "This is absolutely insulting. We dedicated our lives to caring for Samuel during his illness. If he provided us with compensation for our sacrifices, that was his decision. Caring for him?" The words erupted from my throat before I could stop them. "You visited him twice in 6 months. I was there every Sunday reading him the newspaper and bringing him homemade soup because the hospital food made him nauseous." My father's face turned crimson. "Don't you dare lecture us about family obligations, young lady. You abandoned this family when you selfishly refused to honor your commitments." "My commitments?" I stood to match his aggressive posture. "You mean my commitment to marry a man I barely knew so you could merge your precious investment portfolios?" The room erupted into accusations and denials, voices climbing over each other in a symphony of dysfunction. But through the chaos, I noticed Richardson studying a computer screen, his expression growing increasingly grim. "Please, everyone sit down," he commanded with surprising authority. "There's additional evidence we need to discuss." We reluctantly returned to our seats, the tension thick enough to cut with scissors. Our investigation uncovered security footage from Mercy General Hospital where Samuel spent his final 3 weeks. Richardson's fingers moved across his laptop keyboard. The timestamps show regular visits from individuals who signed the visitor log with false names, but facial recognition software identified them as family members. He turned the screen toward us, revealing grainy black and white footage of my parents entering the hospital's intensive care unit at 2 a.m, carrying a briefcase and manila folders. The nursing staff has no record of approving these visits. Samuel was heavily sedated during this time period, yet someone managed to obtain his signature on multiple financial documents during these unauthorized encounters. My hands began trembling as the full scope of their betrayal crystallized. While I'd been working double shifts at the pediatric ward to afford gas money for my Sunday visits, my parents had been systematically looting my grandfather's fortune under cover of darkness. "There's more." Richardson continued, his voice heavy with disgust. "Bank records show that immediately following each hospital visit, substantial transfers were initiated from Samuel's accounts. The timing is too precise to be coincidental." Bradley cleared his throat nervously. "Perhaps we should discuss this privately as a family before involving outside investigators." Family. I turned to face him, years of suppressed anger finally finding their voice. "You want to talk about family? A real family doesn't steal from a dying man. A real family doesn't forge signatures while someone fights cancer. A real family doesn't abandon a daughter for refusing to be sold like livestock." My mother's tears appeared on cue, the same theatrical display she'd perfected during my teenage years. "Jacqueline, sweetheart, you're clearly upset. Let's not make decisions we'll regret later." "The only regret I have," I said, standing to leave, "is believing that any of you were capable of basic human decency." As I gathered my purse and headed toward the door, Richardson called after me. "Miss Stevens, there's one more thing. We found evidence of additional financial irregularities dating back several years. This investigation is far from over." I paused in the doorway, looking back at the people who'd given me life but never shown me love. My parents sat rigid in their chairs, their earlier confidence replaced by barely concealed panic. Bradley stared at his shoes, unable to meet my gaze. "Good," I said quietly. "I hope you find every stolen penny." The elevator doors closed behind me, and for the first time in 10 years, I felt truly alone, but somehow free. My grandfather had tried to give me security, but my family had turned his final gift into another battlefield. The war for my inheritance had only just begun, and I was outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and completely unprepared for what lay ahead. But I was also determined to honor the man who'd loved me unconditionally, even if it meant destroying the people who'd never deserved his generosity. 3 days after the will reading, I sat across from Martha Sullivan in her downtown Manhattan office, surrounded by towers of financial documents that chronicled my family's systematic theft. Martha was a forensic accountant who specialized in inheritance fraud, and her preliminary findings made my stomach churn with disgust. "Jacqueline, what we're looking at isn't just opportunistic theft." Martha explained, her silver hair pulled back in a severe bun that matched her no-nonsense demeanor. "This is a sophisticated long-term conspiracy that required extensive planning and coordination." She spread 3 computer printouts across her glass desk, each one detailing a different shell company. Compassionate Care Holdings, Premium Family Services, and Heritage Medical Solutions. All 3 were established 18 months ago, well before your grandfather's cancer diagnosis became public knowledge. I studied the incorporation documents, noting the familiar signatures at the bottom. My parents were planning this while grandfather was still healthy. It appears so. Each company lists different board members, but the registered addresses all trace back to buildings owned by your father's real estate portfolio. Martha highlighted several addresses with a yellow marker. They created an entire network of fake businesses to justify stealing from Samuel's accounts. My phone buzzed with yet another call from Bradley. I'd been avoiding his attempts to reach me since storming out of the law office, but his persistence was becoming concerning. "My cousin keeps calling," I told Martha. "He claims he wants to explain everything." Martha's expression hardened. "I strongly advise against speaking with any family members without legal representation present. Based on what we've uncovered, Bradley isn't an innocent bystander in this scheme." She pulled out another folder, this one marked with a red confidential stamp. "Your cousin submitted paperwork to the probate court requesting emergency executor privileges 3 weeks before Samuel passed away. The documentation claims your grandfather was mentally incompetent and needed immediate financial protection." "That's impossible," I protested. "I visited grandfather the weekend before he died. He was weak physically, but his mind was completely sharp. We discussed my nursing career, his concerns about climate change, even his disappointment in the Yankees' pitching rotation." "I believe you," Martha said gently. But Bradley provided sworn statements from 2 physicians claiming Samuel was suffering from severe dementia. Dr. Winston Hayes and Dr. Rebecca Martinez both signed affidavits declaring your grandfather unfit to manage his affairs. I grabbed the documents, scanning the medical opinions that painted my beloved grandfather as a confused, paranoid shadow of himself. These doctors never treated him. His oncologist was Dr. Patricia Newberg at Mount Sinai. I have all his medical records. Martha nodded grimly. "That's why Bradley's filing was rejected by the court initially. But then something interesting happened. He appealed the decision and suddenly had supporting documentation from a psychiatric evaluation conducted at Riverside Mental Health Facility. Grandfather was never at Riverside," I said, my voice rising with indignation. "He received all his treatment at Mount Sinai because they had the best cancer specialists in the city." "Exactly, which is why we hired a private investigator to visit Riverside Mental Health." Martha's smile was predatory. "Angela Morris discovered some fascinating information about their records department." She handed me a digital tablet displaying photographs of check stubs and bank statements. Someone paid Riverside $50,000 in cash to create false medical records, showing Samuel was treated there for progressive dementia. The payment was made through one of those shell companies your parents established. My hands shook as I scrolled through the evidence. My family hadn't just stolen money from a dying man, they'd attempted to destroy his reputation and mental legacy in the process. "There's more," Martha continued. "Angela also uncovered communication records between Bradley and several courthouse employees. Apparently, your cousin has been very generous with his donations to certain staff members' personal bank accounts." She showed me printouts of text messages between Bradley and someone named Jennifer Walsh, a clerk in the probate court's records department. The messages discussed adjusting filing dates and expediting processing for estate documents, all in exchange for payments ranging from $5,000 to $15,000. Jennifer Walsh has worked in that courthouse for 12 years without any disciplinary actions, Martha explained. But suddenly, she's able to afford a new BMW and a vacation home in the Hamptons, all on a civil servant's salary. I felt physically sick as the scope of the conspiracy became clear. How many people were involved in this? Based on what we've discovered so far, at least 7 individuals participated in defrauding your grandfather's estate. Your parents, your cousin, 2 fake doctors, the courthouse clerk, and someone inside Samuel's bank who approved the fraudulent transactions. Martha pulled up another document on her computer screen. The bank employee is particularly troubling. Amanda Foster worked as a senior accounts manager at First National Trust, where Samuel maintained his primary checking and investment accounts. She bypassed normal verification procedures to approve wire transfers totaling over $40 million. How is that possible? I asked. Don't banks have safeguards against unauthorized withdrawals? They do, but Amanda Foster overrode those safeguards using executive privileges reserved for emergency situations. She claimed Samuel had personally requested the transfers during a branch visit, but security footage shows he never entered that building during the time period in question. I stared at the evidence spread across Martha's desk, each document representing another layer of betrayal by people I'd trusted my entire life. What about the money they stole? Can we recover any of it? Martha's expression grew cautious. Recovery will be challenging. The funds were moved through multiple international accounts designed to obscure their final destination. However, Angela Morris has connections with federal investigators who specialize in tracking offshore financial crimes. She handed me a business card for Agent Sarah Chen with the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit. Agent Chen has been investigating a pattern of elder abuse cases involving wealthy families in the tri-state area. Your grandfather's situation fits the profile of several other cases she's working. Other families are going through this, too. Unfortunately, yes, inheritance fraud targeting elderly individuals has become increasingly sophisticated. Criminal networks share information about vulnerable targets and proven methods for exploiting legal loopholes. I stood up and walked to Martha's floor-to-ceiling windows looking down at the busy Manhattan street below. Hundreds of people hurried along the sidewalks, completely unaware that my world was crumbling, just 20 floors above their heads. Martha, can I ask you something personal? Of course. In all your years investigating financial crimes, have you ever seen a family this ruthless toward their own relatives? She joined me at the window, her reflection somber in the glass. Jacqueline, greed transforms people into monsters. I've seen children murder their parents for life insurance money. Spouses poison their partners for retirement funds, and siblings destroy each other over property inheritances. Money doesn't corrupt character, it reveals character. My phone buzzed again with another call from Bradley. This time I answered. Jacqueline, thank goodness. His voice sounded desperate. We need to talk immediately. You don't understand what's really happening. I understand perfectly, I replied coldly. You helped our parents steal from a dying man. That's not how it happened, Bradley protested. Uncle Samuel asked us to help protect his assets from potential health care costs. Everything we did was legal and necessary. Then why did you pay courthouse employees to falsify documents? The line went silent for several seconds. When Bradley finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. How did you find out about that? The same way I found out about the fake medical evaluations, the shell companies, and the forged signatures. I hired professionals to investigate what my own family did to my grandfather. Jacqueline, please listen to me. If you pursue this investigation, you're going to destroy everyone. Your parents, me, even yourself. The legal fees alone will consume whatever inheritance you might recover. I looked at Martha, who was monitoring our conversation with obvious interest. Bradley, I have one question for you. While grandfather was dying, while he was frightened and in pain, did any of you feel even a moment of guilt about stealing from him? Another long silence stretched between us. Answer me, I demanded. It wasn't supposed to hurt him. Bradley said finally. He was going to die anyway. The money was just sitting there, and your parents had sacrificed so much over the years to support him. We thought... I hung up the phone. Martha placed a comforting hand on my shoulder. I know this is devastating, but you're making the right choice. Samuel deserves justice, and you deserve your inheritance. It's not about the money anymore, I said, wiping tears from my cheeks. It's about honoring the only person in my family who ever loved me unconditionally. Then let's get started, Martha replied with determination. We have a lot of work to do. As we returned to her desk to continue reviewing evidence, I realized my grandfather's gift wasn't just financial security. He'd given me the strength to stand up to the people who'd controlled and manipulated me my entire life. For the first time since I was 18 years old, I felt truly powerful. The war for my inheritance was about to escalate, but I was no longer fighting alone. 2 weeks later, I sat in Judge Patricia Henley's courtroom watching my parents' attorney present their case for overturning my grandfather's will. Winston Crawford was everything I'd expected from a lawyer, charging $800 per hour, silver-haired, immaculately dressed, and possessed of the kind of arrogant confidence that money could buy. Your Honor, Crawford announced in his theatrical baritone voice, the evidence clearly demonstrates that Samuel Stevens was suffering from severe cognitive decline during the final months of his life. The will in question was drafted during a period when Mr. Stevens lacked the mental capacity to understand the consequences of his decisions. I watched Judge Henley nod sympathetically from her elevated bench, her expression suggesting she'd already made up her mind, despite not having heard any testimony yet. Something about her demeanor troubled me, but I couldn't identify exactly what felt wrong. My attorney, David Ramirez, stood to present our counter-argument. David was everything Winston Crawford wasn't: young, passionate, and genuinely outraged by my family's behavior. He'd taken my case after Martha Sullivan recommended him as someone who specialized in inheritance fraud. Your Honor, with respect, the petitioners have failed to provide any credible evidence of mental incapacity, David argued. Mr. Stevens' medical records from Mount Sinai Hospital show no signs of dementia or cognitive impairment. His treating physician, Dr. Patricia Newberg, has submitted a sworn affidavit confirming that Samuel Stevens remained mentally sharp until his death. Judge Henley interrupted him mid-sentence. Counselor, I've reviewed Dr. Newberg's statement, but it contradicts the psychological evaluation conducted at Riverside Mental Health Facility. When medical opinions conflict, I must consider which evaluation was more comprehensive. David looked confused. Your Honor, we've submitted documentation proving that Mr. Stevens was never treated at Riverside Mental Health. The evaluation in question appears to be fabricated. That's a serious accusation, Judge Henley replied sharply. Do you have definitive proof that licensed medical professionals committed fraud? We're prepared to call witnesses who can testify. Motion denied. I will not allow this courtroom to become a platform for unsubstantiated conspiracy theories. I exchanged shocked glances with David. We'd submitted bank record security footage and sworn statements documenting the fraudulent medical evaluation, but Judge Henley was refusing to consider any of it. Crawford smiled triumphantly. Your Honor, we also have concerns about the defendant's emotional stability. Ms. Stevens has made wild accusations against her own family, suggesting they participated in some elaborate theft conspiracy. These delusions indicate she may have inherited her grandfather's mental instability. Objection! David shouted, jumping to his feet. Counsel is making personal attacks without any supporting evidence. Sustained, Judge Henley said half-heartedly. Mr. Crawford, please limit your comments to relevant facts. But the damage was done. I could see several people in the gallery whispering among themselves, probably wondering if I was mentally unfit to inherit my grandfather's fortune. The hearing continued for 3 hours, with Crawford presenting his carefully constructed narrative of a confused elderly man manipulated by his granddaughter into disinheriting his devoted son and daughter. Every piece of evidence we tried to introduce was either ruled inadmissible or dismissed as circumstantial. When Judge Henley called a recess, David pulled me into the hallway corridor. "Something is very wrong here," he said in a low voice. "I've practiced inheritance law for 8 years, and I've never seen a judge refuse to consider documented evidence of fraud. What does that mean for my case?" "It means we need to be prepared for an unfavorable ruling. Judge Henley seems determined to side with your parents regardless of what evidence we present." I felt the walls closing in around me as the reality of my situation became clear. My family hadn't just stolen my grandfather's money, they'd corrupted the entire legal system that was supposed to protect me. That evening, I called Angela Morris, the private investigator who'd uncovered the courthouse bribery scheme. "Angela, can you dig deeper into Judge Henley's background?" Something about her behavior in court today felt personal. "Already on it," Angela replied. "I started investigating her financial records after watching the hearing this morning. Give me 24 hours. The next afternoon, Angela called with information that made my blood run cold. "Jacqueline, you're not going to believe what I found. Judge Patricia Henley and your cousin Bradley were roommates at Columbia Law School. They graduated in the same class, participated in the same study groups, and remained friends for years after graduation." "That's a conflict of interest," I said. "She should have recused herself from the case." "It gets worse. Henley received $50,000 in campaign contributions during her last election cycle. The donations came from 3 different political action committees, all funded by the same shell companies your parents used to steal from Samuel." I sat down heavily on my apartment's worn couch, overwhelmed by the scope of the conspiracy. How many people are involved in this? "Based on what I've uncovered, at least 12 individuals have received payments related to your inheritance case. Courthouse clerks, bank employees, medical professionals, and now a sitting judge. This is organized crime, Jacqueline. What can we do? We need to contact federal authorities. This level of corruption requires FBI intervention." That night, I barely slept as the weight of fighting an entire criminal network settled on my shoulders. I was a pediatric nurse from Queens, going up against wealthy, connected individuals who'd spent months planning my destruction. The next morning brought more devastating news. David called to inform me that Judge Henley had scheduled an emergency hearing to consider my parents' motion for immediate asset protection. "They're claiming you're attempting to hide inheritance funds offshore," David explained. "Crawford submitted documentation showing suspicious financial activity in accounts bearing your name." "That's impossible. I don't have any offshore accounts." "I know, but someone has created accounts using your identity and social security number. If Judge Henley freezes your assets, you won't be able to access any inheritance funds until the will contest is resolved." I met David at the courthouse 2 hours before the emergency hearing, hoping to review the fraudulent documents Crawford had submitted. What we discovered made me physically nauseous. These bank statements show wire transfers totaling $20 million to accounts in Switzerland and the Cayman Islands. David said, studying the paperwork. "The transactions were supposedly initiated from your personal checking account." I looked at the account numbers and routing information. "This isn't my bank. I've had the same checking account at Community Trust for 6 years. I don't even have $20,000, let alone $20 million. Someone created these accounts using your personal information, then generated fake transaction records to make it appear you're hiding assets. It's sophisticated identity theft designed to support their legal strategy." Judge Henley entered the courtroom with a grim expression that suggested she'd already decided our fate. "I've reviewed the emergency motion and supporting documentation. Given the evidence of potential asset concealment, I'm ordering an immediate freeze on all accounts associated with the Stevens estate." David stood to object. "Your Honor, these documents are clearly fabricated. My client has no access to the funds in question, and the account numbers don't correspond to any legitimate financial institutions." "Counselor, are you suggesting that licensed banking professionals committed fraud to create false records?" "Yes, Your Honor. That's exactly what I'm suggesting, and we have evidence to support that claim." Judge Henley's voice turned icy. I will not tolerate accusations of criminal conspiracy in my courtroom. The asset freeze stands until this matter is resolved. As court officers began processing the paperwork that would lock away my inheritance indefinitely, I caught sight of Bradley sitting in the back of the courtroom. He was smiling. After the hearing, David and I stood on the courthouse steps in stunned silence. What just happened in there? I asked. You just witnessed judicial corruption in action, David replied grimly. Judge Henley isn't interested in justice. She's protecting her friends. I looked back at the imposing courthouse building, its marble columns and bronze statues, representing ideals of fairness and equality that had been completely abandoned. My grandfather's fortune was now frozen. My family had painted me as a criminal, and the legal system designed to protect me had been purchased by my enemies. But as I walked away from that courthouse, I made a decision that would change everything. If my family wanted to fight dirty, I would give them a war they weren't prepared for. The next morning, I called Agent Sarah Chen at the FBI. Agent Sarah Chen's office in Federal Plaza was nothing like the luxurious law firms I'd been visiting. Gray metal furniture, fluorescent lighting, and walls covered with organizational charts tracking financial crimes across multiple states. But for the first time in weeks, I felt like someone was actually listening to me. Miss Stevens, what you're describing fits a pattern we've been investigating for the past 2 years, Agent Chen said as she reviewed the evidence Martha Sullivan had compiled. We call it the Family Trust Network, organized criminal groups that target elderly individuals with substantial assets. She pulled up a computer presentation showing a web of connected cases across New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut. 47 families have reported similar inheritance frauds. The perpetrators use the same shell companies, the same corrupt professionals, and the same legal strategies to steal from dying relatives. I studied the presentation slides, recognizing several of the fake company names that had appeared in my grandfather's financial records. How much money are we talking about? Conservatively, over $800 million stolen from elderly victims in the past 3 years. Agent Chen's expression hardened. Your case is particularly significant because your grandfather's estate represents the largest target they've attempted. My phone rang with yet another call from Bradley. I'd been ignoring his increasingly desperate messages, but Agent Chen gestured for me to answer while she activated recording equipment. Jacqueline, please, you have to stop this investigation. Bradley's voice crackled through the speakerphone. You don't understand what you're up against. These people don't just steal money, they destroy anyone who threatens their operation. What people? I demanded. You mean our family? Our family is just one part of something much bigger. There's a whole network of lawyers, judges, accountants, and business owners who profit from these schemes. If you expose them, they'll come after you with everything they have. Agent Chen motioned for me to keep him talking. Bradley, how long have you been involved with this network? It started small, he said, his voice breaking with apparent emotion. Your parents approached me 3 years ago about protecting family assets from estate taxes. They introduced me to some financial planners who specialized in creative wealth preservation strategies. You mean theft? It wasn't supposed to be theft. These consultants had legitimate methods for transferring assets before someone died. The idea was to preserve family wealth instead of losing it to government taxes and healthcare costs. Agent Chen showed me a notepad with questions she wanted me to ask. What consultants? Give me names. Bradley hesitated for several seconds. Marcus Wellington runs the operation. He's a lawyer who represents wealthy families across the Northeast. His firm specializes in emergency estate planning for clients with terminal illnesses. Agent Chen nodded grimly and typed the name into her computer. Marcus Wellington appeared on several FBI watch lists related to elder abuse investigations. Bradley, how many other families has this network targeted? I don't know exact numbers, maybe dozens. Marcus has associates in multiple states who identify potential clients' elderly people with substantial assets and complicated family dynamics. You mean vulnerable people they can exploit? Jacqueline, you have to understand, most of these elderly individuals would have lost their money anyway. Nursing home costs, medical bills, estate taxes. At least this way the wealth stays within families instead of being consumed by institutions. I felt physically sick listening to Bradley rationalize stealing from dying people. What about grandfather? How did they identify him as a target? Your parents have been working with Marcus for years. When Samuel's cancer diagnosis became serious, they reached out for advice about protecting his assets. Marcus's team conducted a full financial evaluation and developed a comprehensive extraction plan. Agent Chen's fingers moved rapidly across her keyboard, taking notes about every detail Bradley revealed. She held up a sign asking me to inquire about specific timelines. When exactly did this planning begin? About 18 months ago. Marcus's research team identified Samuel as an ideal candidate because he was wealthy, elderly, and had complicated family relationships that could be exploited in court. Complicated family relationships? I repeated slowly. You mean the fact that I'd been estranged from my parents? That was actually perfect for their strategy. Marcus explained that inheritance disputes are easier to manipulate when families are already divided. They could paint you as an opportunistic outsider who manipulated Samuel during his illness. Agent Chen handed me another note. Ask about other victims. Bradley, who else has this network targeted recently? I can't give you specific names. That would be what illegal like forging medical documents and bribing judges. Bradley's voice became desperate. Jacqueline, I'm trying to protect you. Marcus Wellington isn't just a lawyer. He's connected to some very dangerous people. If you continue this investigation, you could end up like Eleanor Hartwell. Agent Chen's eyes widened. She quickly typed Eleanor Hartwell into her computer and motioned for me to keep Bradley talking. Who is Eleanor Hartwell? She was an heiress in Greenwich whose family tried to steal her trust fund. When she hired investigators and contacted federal authorities, she died in a car accident before the case went to trial. Are you saying they murdered her? I'm saying that people who threaten Marcus's operation tend to experience unfortunate accidents, car crashes, home invasions, sudden medical emergencies. The police never find evidence of foul play. Agent Chen was now typing furiously and making phone calls to other agents in her office. The name Eleanor Hartwell had clearly triggered some kind of alert in their system. Bradley, I need you to come to FBI headquarters immediately. We can protect you if you're willing to testify about this network. Are you insane? If Marcus finds out I've been talking to federal agents, I'm dead. My only chance is to convince you to drop this investigation and accept whatever settlement your parents offer. What settlement? They're willing to give you $50 million to walk away. You sign a confidentiality agreement, they keep the rest of Samuel's estate, and everyone moves on with their lives. I looked at Agent Chen, who was shaking her head vigorously. $50 million out of $2.5 billion, I said. That's quite generous of them. It's more money than you could spend in 3 lifetimes, Bradley argued. You could buy a mansion, travel the world, never work another day. Why risk your life for money you don't even need? Because it's not about the money, I said quietly. It's about justice for grandfather and all the other elderly people this network has victimized. Then you've signed your own death warrant, Bradley whispered before hanging up. Agent Chen immediately began coordinating with other FBI offices across multiple states. Within an hour, I learned that Eleanor Hartwell was indeed dead, along with 3 other inheritance fraud whistleblowers who died under suspicious circumstances in the past 18 months. Miss Stevens, we're placing you in protective custody, effective immediately, Agent Chen announced. Your cousin just revealed that you're up against a criminal organization responsible for multiple murders. As federal marshals escorted me to a safe house in New Jersey, I realized my fight for justice had evolved into a battle for survival. Marcus Wellington's network had killed people to protect their operation, and I'd just become their next target. But I also realized something else. My grandfather's estate wasn't just about money anymore. It was evidence that could bring down an entire criminal empire and save countless other families from the horror mine had endured. The war was far from over, but the stakes had just gotten much higher. The FBI safe house was a nondescript two-story colonial in suburban Morristown, complete with bulletproof windows and federal agents monitoring every entrance. I'd been there for 3 days when Agent Chen arrived with news that would change everything. Jacqueline, our forensics team, finished processing your grandfather's personal belongings from his apartment, she said, setting a metal evidence box on the kitchen table. We found something extraordinary hidden behind his bedroom portrait. She opened the box to reveal a sophisticated recording device, dozens of USB drives, and a leather journal filled with my grandfather's handwriting. Samuel Stevens was conducting his own investigation into your family's criminal activities. He documented everything. I picked up the journal with trembling hands, recognizing my grandfather's distinctive penmanship. The first entry was dated 2 years ago. Patricia and Robert approached me today about financial planning for my estate. They brought a lawyer named Marcus Wellington, who explained how wealthy families protect their assets from taxes and healthcare costs. Something about their presentation felt rehearsed, almost predatory. I've decided to secretly record all future conversations with family members. Agent Chen activated one of the USB drives on her laptop. Your grandfather installed hidden cameras throughout his apartment and recorded every interaction with your parents, Bradley and Marcus Wellington's associates. He gathered evidence for 22 months. The first video showed my parents sitting in my grandfather's living room, discussing strategies for gaining control of his finances. My mother's voice was sickeningly sweet as she explained how much they cared about protecting his legacy. "Samuel, darling, we just want to ensure your money doesn't disappear into government coffers when you pass away," she said, stroking his hand with fake affection. "Marcus has helped dozens of families preserve their wealth through strategic asset transfers." My grandfather's response surprised me. "Patricia, are you suggesting I should give you my money while I'm still alive?" "Not give exactly. More like legally restructure your holdings to minimize estate taxes and potential healthcare seizures. You'd maintain full access to your funds, but the technical ownership would transfer to family trusts managed by people who understand complex financial systems." "People like you and Robert, well, yes, we have the business experience and family connections necessary to preserve your legacy for future generations." Agent Chen fast-forwarded to another recording from 6 months later. This one showed Bradley and Marcus Wellington presenting my grandfather with documents that would transfer control of his assets to shell companies. "Mr. Stevens, these trust structures are completely standard among wealthy families," Wellington explained in his smooth professional voice. "Your son and daughter-in-law will serve as trustees, but you retain all beneficial rights to your property until your death." My grandfather studied the paperwork carefully. "What happens if I become mentally incapacitated? Who makes financial decisions on my behalf?" The trust documents include provisions for temporary management during medical emergencies. Wellington replied, "Your designated family members would have authority to protect your assets from any healthcare-related expenses or legal complications, such as nursing home costs, experimental treatments, even potential lawsuits from disgruntled family members who might contest your will." I watched my grandfather's expression change as he realized the true purpose of these documents. "You're referring to my granddaughter, Jacqueline." "Well, sir, we understand there have been some family tensions related to her refusal to honor certain obligations. These trust structures would protect your estate from any future claims she might make." My grandfather set the documents down without signing them. "Gentlemen, I think I need more time to consider this proposal." After Wellington and Bradley left, the recording continued with my grandfather speaking directly to his hidden camera. "They think I'm a foolish old man who doesn't understand their scheme. But I spent 40 years building a business empire by recognizing predators when I encountered them. They want to steal my life's work and destroy my granddaughter in the process." Agent Chen showed me dozens of similar recordings, each one documenting another aspect of my family's conspiracy. My grandfather had captured conversations about forged medical documents, courthouse bribes, and plans to have me declared mentally unstable if I challenged their theft. "There's more," Agent Chen said, loading another USB drive. "Samuel also recorded phone conversations between your parents and other families involved in similar schemes. We now have evidence connecting Marcus Wellington's network to inheritance fraud across 7 states. The phone recordings revealed the scope of the criminal organization Bradley had warned me about. Wealthy families across the Northeast were systematically looting their elderly relatives' estates using identical methods. Fake medical evaluations, corrupted court officials, and intimidation tactics targeting any family members who resisted. Your grandfather was building a case against the entire network," Agent Chen explained. "He planned to contact federal authorities after gathering sufficient evidence, but his cancer progressed faster than expected." I found my grandfather's final journal entry written just weeks before his death. "My time is running short, but I've compiled enough evidence to destroy the criminals who masquerade as my family. Jacqueline is the only person I trust to use this information responsibly. She has the strength and integrity to seek justice, even if it means standing alone against everyone else. I pray she finds this evidence before they steal her inheritance and destroy her life." Tears streamed down my face as I realized my grandfather had spent his final months protecting me from dangers I hadn't even known existed. While I'd been visiting him on Sundays, bringing soup and reading newspapers, he'd been secretly waging war against my parents' criminal conspiracy. "There's one more thing," Agent Chen said gently. "Samuel established a second estate account that your family doesn't know about. He transferred $1 billion to an international trust based in Switzerland, with you as the sole beneficiary." She handed me legal documents bearing my grandfather's signature and an official Swiss banking seal. "Even if your parents succeed in stealing everything from his domestic accounts, you'll still inherit a substantial portion of his wealth. He protected you, Jacqueline." I stared at the trust documents, overwhelmed by my grandfather's foresight and love. He'd anticipated every move my family would make and prepared countermeasures to ensure his real legacy would reach me safely. "What happens now?" I asked. "Now we take down Marcus Wellington's entire network," Agent Chen replied with fierce determination. "Your grandfather gave us everything we need to prosecute the largest inheritance fraud conspiracy in federal history. We're coordinating with agents in 6 other states to arrest over 40 individuals simultaneously." She opened another folder containing arrest warrants for my parents, Bradley Judge Henley, and dozens of other co-conspirators. "Tomorrow morning, we execute coordinated raids on their homes offices and bank accounts. Everyone involved in defrauding your grandfather will face federal charges." "What about the death threats Bradley said people who oppose this network end up dead?" "That's why we've been building our case in complete secrecy. Wellington's people won't know what's happening until federal agents are knocking on their doors. By the time they realize they've been exposed, it'll be too late to retaliate." I looked at the evidence my grandfather had risked his life to collect, understanding, for the first time, the true magnitude of his sacrifice. He'd spent his final months alone, secretly recording the people he'd trusted most, all to protect a granddaughter he'd only been able to visit in secret. "Agent Chen, I want to be there when you arrest my parents." She studied my face carefully. "Are you sure it won't be pleasant?" "I need to look them in the eyes when they realize their crimes have consequences. I owe that to my grandfather." "Then we'll make sure you're there," she said. "Samuel Stevens deserves to see justice served even if he can't witness it himself." That night, as I prepared for the most important day of my life, I felt my grandfather's presence surrounding me like armor. His love had transcended death to give me the weapons I needed to defeat the people who'd stolen from him and planned to destroy me. Tomorrow the war would finally end, and this time justice would prevail. At 6 a.m. on a crisp Tuesday morning, I sat in an unmarked FBI vehicle across the street from my parents' Westchester mansion, watching federal agents prepare for coordinated raids across 3 states. Agent Chen had positioned me where I could observe my parents' arrest while remaining safely out of harm's way. "All teams report ready," Chen's voice crackled through the radio. "Execute in 3, 2, 1. 20 federal agents in tactical gear swarmed my childhood home, their black SUVs blocking every exit route. Through the mansion's floor-to-ceiling windows, I could see my parents stumbling down the grand staircase in their silk pajamas, faces twisted with shock and terror. Agent Rodriguez read them their rights while other agents began searching the house for evidence. "Patricia Stevens, Robert Stevens, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit inheritance fraud, elder abuse, money laundering and racketeering under the RICO Act." My mother's theatrical breakdown began immediately. "This is ridiculous. We're respected members of this community. Our lawyer will have you terminated." "Your lawyer is being arrested simultaneously at his office in Manhattan." Rodriguez replied calmly. "Marcus Wellington is facing federal charges in connection with the largest inheritance fraud network in United States history." My father's face went ashen. "What network? We don't know anything about any network." "Sir, we have recorded conversations between you and 43 other individuals involved in systematically defrauding elderly family members. Your conspiracy spans 7 states and involves over $800 million in stolen assets." Agent Chen's radio crackled with updates from raid teams across the region. Bradley Stevens in custody at his apartment in Manhattan. Judge Patricia Henley arrested at her home in New Jersey. Marcus Wellington and 6 associates arrested at their law firm. All suspects are cooperating. I watch my parents being loaded into separate FBI vehicles, their designer clothes rumpled and their carefully constructed facades crumbling. For the first time in my life, they looked powerless and afraid. "Miss Stevens, would you like to accompany us to the federal building for the interrogations?" Agent Chen asked. "Yes, I want to hear their confessions." 2 hours later, I sat behind one-way glass watching my mother break down under Agent Rodriguez's questioning. The woman who'd raised me to value appearances above all else now looked haggard and desperate as evidence mounted against her. "Mrs. Stevens, we have video recordings of you discussing plans to steal your father-in-law's money while he was dying of cancer. How do you explain these conversations?" My mother's lawyer, a young public defender who'd been appointed after Winston Crawford's arrest, whispered urgently in her ear. "I invoke my 5th Amendment right against self-incrimination." "That's your choice, but you should know that Bradley Stevens has already provided detailed testimony about your role in coordinating the theft. He's given us names, dates, bank account numbers, and documentation of every crime you committed." Agent Chen turned to me. "Your cousin is cooperating fully in exchange for a reduced sentence. He's provided evidence about 37 other families that were victimized by this network." The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. Marcus Wellington had operated what amounted to an inheritance theft factory, targeting wealthy, elderly individuals across the Northeast and systematically looting their estates through corruption and fraud. "How many people were involved?" I asked. 64 individuals have been arrested so far, including 12 attorneys, 8 judges, 19 bank employees, 7 medical professionals, and multiple courthouse clerks. The network generated over $900 million in stolen assets over 5 years. I watched my father's interrogation on a second monitor. Unlike my mother, he was attempting to negotiate a plea bargain by providing information about other conspirators. "I can give you the names of families in Connecticut and Pennsylvania who are planning similar thefts," he told Agent Martinez. "Wellington's network has identified at least 20 new targets with terminal illnesses and substantial assets. In exchange for what? Reduced charges, maybe home confinement instead of federal prison. I'm 68 years old. A lengthy sentence would be a death penalty." Agent Martinez consulted a thick folder of evidence. Mr. Stevens, you participated in stealing from a dying man who trusted you. You forged his signature, bribed court officials, and threatened your own daughter. What makes you think you deserve lenient treatment? My father's composure finally cracked. Samuel was going to die anyway. The money was just sitting there while he wasted away in that hospital bed. At least our plan kept the wealth in the family instead of losing it to taxes and medical bills. Your plan involved stealing from your daughter the rightful heir to Samuel's estate. Jacqueline abandoned this family years ago. She had no right to Samuel's money after refusing to honor her obligations to our business partnerships. I felt Agent Chen's hand on my shoulder as my father revealed the depth of his selfishness and entitlement. Even facing federal prosecution, he couldn't acknowledge that I'd been the victim of his crimes. The interrogations continued for 6 hours, gradually revealing the full extent of the conspiracy. Marcus Wellington had recruited corrupt professionals across multiple states to create an efficient system for stealing from elderly victims. They targeted families with existing tensions, exploited legal loopholes, and eliminated anyone who threatened their operation. Miss Stevens, we've recovered $847 million in stolen assets, Agent Chen announced as we reviewed the day's developments. Your grandfather's case was just one part of a massive criminal enterprise, but his evidence was crucial to bringing down the entire network. What happens to my parents now? They're facing federal RICO charges, which carry potential sentences of 20 to 40 years in prison. Given their ages and the severity of their crimes, they'll likely spend the rest of their lives incarcerated. That evening, I returned to my Queens apartment for the first time in 2 weeks. The familiar surroundings felt strange after everything I'd experienced, but I was grateful for the normalcy of my small space and simple furniture. My phone rang with a call from an international number. Miss Stevens, this is Heinrich Mueller from Credit Suisse Private Banking in Geneva. I'm calling regarding the trust account your grandfather established for your benefit. Yes. The trust has been activated following verification of your identity and the resolution of legal proceedings in the United States. You now have access to $1,047 million plus accumulated interest from the past 18 months. I sat down heavily on my couch, overwhelmed by the reality of my grandfather's foresight. Even while fighting cancer and exposing my family's conspiracy, he'd ensured my financial security through an untouchable international trust. Sir, what are the conditions for accessing these funds? There are no restrictions, Miss Stevens. Your grandfather's instructions were simply that you use the money wisely and help others who cannot protect themselves. He believed you would honor his values. After ending the call, I stood at my apartment window looking out at the Queens neighborhood where I'd built my independent life. My grandfather had given me more than financial security. He'd provided the resources to make a difference in the world. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt genuinely hopeful about the future. Justice had been served, my family's crimes had been exposed, and I had the means to honor my grandfather's legacy by protecting other vulnerable people. The war was over, and somehow goodness had triumphed over greed. 6 months after my family's arrest, I stood in the conference room of my newly established foundation, surrounded by staff members who shared my commitment to protecting elderly Americans from inheritance fraud. The Samuel Stevens Foundation for Elder Justice had grown from a personal mission into a national organization that investigated suspicious estate cases and provided legal assistance to vulnerable families. Jacqueline, we've received 47 new case referrals this week, announced Dr. Margaret Foster, our Director of Victim Services. Margaret was a retired social worker who dedicated her career to elder abuse prevention, and her expertise had been invaluable in developing our intervention protocols. How many appear to involve organized networks like the one that targeted my grandfather? At least 12 show patterns consistent with systematic inheritance fraud. Fake medical evaluations, corrupted court proceedings, and coordinated asset transfers through shell companies. I reviewed the case files, recognizing the familiar signatures of Marcus Wellington's criminal methodology. Although he and his primary associates were now serving lengthy federal sentences, copycat networks had emerged to fill the void left by their arrests. "What's our success rate in stopping these thefts?" 83%, replied James Morrison, our chief investigator and former FBI agent. "When we intervene early with documentary evidence and law enforcement coordination, most conspirators abandon their schemes rather than risk federal prosecution." The Foundation had recovered over $200 million in stolen assets during our first 6 months of operation. But more importantly, we'd prevented countless elderly individuals from experiencing the betrayal my grandfather had endured. My phone buzzed with a call from Agent Chen, who'd become both a professional colleague and personal friend during the ongoing prosecutions. "Jacqueline, I have updates on your family's cases." "How did the sentencing hearing go?" "Your parents were each sentenced to 35 years in federal prison without possibility of parole. Judge Harrison called their crimes a profound betrayal of family trust and basic human decency. Bradley received 15 years for his cooperation with our investigation." I felt a complex mix of emotions: relief that justice had been served, but also sadness that our family's story had ended with such destruction. "Have they expressed any remorse for what they did to grandfather?" "Your mother submitted a letter to the court claiming she was manipulated by Marcus Wellington and never intended to hurt Samuel. Your father maintains that everything they did was legal asset protection." Even after being convicted by a federal jury, greed and entitlement don't disappear just because someone faces consequences. They still believe they were entitled to Samuel's money, and you were the one who disrupted their rightful inheritance. Agent Chen paused before continuing. "There is one development you should know about. Your parents have requested a meeting with you. They want to apologize and attempt some form of reconciliation." I walked to my office window, looking down at the Manhattan street where ordinary people lived honest lives without stealing from their dying relatives. "What do you think I should do?" "That's entirely your decision. They're not dangerous anymore. They'll spend the rest of their lives in prison. But you shouldn't feel obligated to forgive people who showed you no mercy when they had power over your life." I considered my options carefully. Part of me wanted to face my parents one final time, to hear them acknowledge their crimes and express genuine remorse. But another part recognized that their request for reconciliation might be just another manipulation attempt. "I'll meet with them once," I decided. Not because I owe them forgiveness, but because I want closure on this chapter of my life. 2 weeks later, I sat across from my parents in a federal prison visiting room, separated by reinforced glass, and speaking through monitored telephones. They looked older and frailer in their orange jumpsuits, stripped of the wealth and status that had once defined their identities. My mother spoke first, her voice trembling with what appeared to be genuine emotion. "Jacqueline, sweetheart, I know what we did was wrong. I wake up every morning regretting the choices that brought us to this place." "What specifically do you regret?" I asked. "Stealing from your grandfather, trying to manipulate the legal system, putting you through this horrible ordeal." "What about cutting me off when I was 18? Do you regret forcing me to choose between marrying a stranger and losing my family?" She hesitated before answering. "That situation was complicated. We thought marriage to Harrison would provide you with security and social standing." "You thought it would provide you with a business merger," I corrected. "My happiness was never part of your equation." My father leaned forward, his expression earnest. "Jacqueline, we made terrible mistakes, but we're still your parents. We love you despite everything that's happened. If you loved me, you wouldn't have stolen my inheritance. If you loved me, you wouldn't have tried to have me declared mentally incompetent. If you loved me, you wouldn't have threatened my life when I refused to cooperate with your crimes." "We never threatened your life," he protested. "Marcus Wellington's network murdered 4 people who opposed their operation. You were part of that network." My parents exchanged glances, and I saw recognition dawn in their eyes. They finally understood the true scope of the criminal organization they'd joined and the potential consequences I'd faced by fighting them. "We didn't know about the murders," my mother whispered. "Marcus never told us that people were being killed." "You didn't want to know," I replied. "You were too focused on stealing grandfather's money to care about the risks to anyone else, including me." We talked for another 30 minutes, but it became clear that my parents still didn't fully comprehend the magnitude of their betrayal. They viewed themselves as victims of Marcus Wellington's manipulation rather than willing participants in elder abuse and inheritance fraud. When the visit ended, I felt a sense of finality rather than reconciliation. These people had given me life, but they'd never truly been family in any meaningful sense. My real family consisted of people like my grandfather, who'd loved me unconditionally, and the staff members who now worked alongside me to protect vulnerable elderly individuals. As I drove back to Manhattan, I reflected on the lessons this experience had taught me. Money reveals character rather than creating it. Family is defined by love and loyalty, not blood relationships. Justice sometimes requires standing alone against everyone else you've ever trusted. But the most important lesson was that true wealth comes from using your resources to protect people who cannot protect themselves. My grandfather had given me more than financial security. He'd provided the opportunity to honor his memory by preventing other families from experiencing our tragedy. 6 months later, I stood before a congressional committee investigating elder abuse, testifying about the need for stronger federal protections for elderly Americans. Honorable representatives, inheritance fraud has become a billion-dollar criminal industry that preys on our most vulnerable citizens during their final months of life. Ms. Stevens asked Congresswoman Martinez, "What specific reforms would prevent the crimes committed against your grandfather?" Mandatory background checks for anyone seeking power of attorney over elderly individuals, federal oversight of probate courts to prevent judicial corruption, criminal penalties for medical professionals who create false evaluations for financial gain. What role should families play in protecting their elderly relatives? Families should be the first line of defense against exploitation, but as my case demonstrates, sometimes families are the source of the threat. We need independent advocacy systems that can intervene when relatives become predators. The hearing led to passage of the Samuel Stevens Elder Protection Act, which established federal standards for inheritance fraud prosecution and created funding for victim assistance programs. My grandfather's name would be forever associated with protecting elderly Americans from the crimes he'd endured. That evening, I visited my grandfather's grave for the first time since his funeral. I'd avoided the cemetery during the legal battles, unable to face his memory, while his killers remained free. But now I felt ready to speak with him about everything that had happened. "Grandfather, I hope you're proud of what we accomplished," I said quietly, placing fresh flowers on his headstone. "Your evidence destroyed the entire network that stole from you and dozens of other families. Your love gave me the strength to fight for justice, even when I was terrified and alone." I told him about the foundation, the congressional testimony, and the new federal protections that would safeguard other elderly individuals. "Your legacy isn't just the money you left me, it's the lives we're saving and the families we're protecting from experiencing what we went through." As the sun set over the peaceful cemetery, I felt my grandfather's presence surrounding me with warmth and approval. He taught me that true success comes from making the world better for people who cannot defend themselves. I learned that the greatest inheritance isn't money, it's the moral courage to stand up for what's right, even when it means standing alone against your own family. Grandfather didn't just leave me his fortune, he left me the strength to fight for justice and the wisdom to use wealth for protecting others. Money can be stolen, but integrity cannot be taken from someone who refuses to surrender it. Love transcends death when it's built on genuine care rather than selfish interest. And sometimes the most important battles are fought not for personal gain, but for the principle that vulnerable people deserve protection from those who would exploit them. My grandfather's final gift wasn't financial. It was the understanding that true wealth comes from service to others and the courage to defend those who cannot defend themselves. Have you ever had to stand up against people you trusted to protect someone you loved? What would you have done if your own family betrayed everything you believed in? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story might help someone else facing a similar situation. Thank you for listening to my journey from betrayal to justice. I hope my grandfather's story inspires you to protect the vulnerable people in your own life and never compromise your integrity for money or family approval. Like this video if you believe justice should prevail over greed. Subscribe for more stories about overcoming family betrayal, and share this with anyone who needs to know they're not alone in fighting for what's right. Remember that true family is built on love and loyalty, not blood and money. Sometimes the greatest act of love is standing up to the people who hurt those we care about, even when it costs us everything we once thought mattered.